Good afternoon. I'm Desiree Dibasen Nanuses, and this is my presentation for the Museums Association of Namibia AGM, annual AGM, and I'm presenting on the panel, and my presentation is titled The Politics of Documentation and Research, and we're focusing, I've tailored it for the Museum of Namibian Fashion and its identity, history, and fashion, right? So a little bit of background introduction about myself. In July of 2024, I successfully defended my viva for the doctoral degree in fine art curatorial practice, and I'm in the process of publicizing these findings and outcomes. My thesis was titled The Politics of My Skin, an autoethnographic practice in decolonizing curatorial practice through case studies at the National Art Gallery of Namibia in Windhoek and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, also known as the Met. I founded the Curatorial Institute in 2021 when I commenced consulting in curatorship, research, and documenting projects, training institutions, professionals on decolonial aspects within the curatorial, as well as revising the strategic plans and policies for institutions whom wish to align with decolonial practices. This led to my nomination and appointment onto the Yale Directors Forum, by the Yale University Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. For this presentation, I will be drawing on this research that I've done within the past 4 years. I will be looking at how we access information. I'll be considering the palimpsest within information, staging versus real, as well as research, its implications, the lack thereof, as well as looking at sustainable flow of information and how one can then have access to that information for research and documenting practices. And ultimately, we'll be looking at how one contemporizes this knowledge to make it an adaptable, applicable to, like the various forms of media that people are currently accessing. My second name, Dibasen, means do it for yourself, right? I'm from the Kwekwekowab tribe. And this autoethnographic practice takes center stage as part of my research. I like to quote Bill Brown, who said, "We look through objects to see what they disclose about history, society, art, cultures, but mostly what they disclose about us, but we only catch a glimpse of things." And this has resulted as my research theory. My practice in itself functions within 3 veins. So I'm a curator, which is obviously for spaces like museums, exhibition making, galleries, research, representing objects, interpreting objects, and obviously writing about these objects. And I function also from curatorship, I function as a researcher because that delves into how, when, why, what happened, and contextualizing that. And then that takes me further into becoming, where I became an academic, which is to write and teach about these findings and what I've encountered. And I focus on myself, my tribe, my culture, my Africa, my Namibia, where I come from, and how I look at my history and my cultural heritage and represent this to the world. Therefore, my practice looks at connecting the intangible knowledge with the indigenous knowledge about heritage objects through how we interpret, how we document, how we represent our objects. We write about it, how we talk about it, becoming the custodians and reclaiming the ownership of the knowledge pertaining to these objects and about yourself and about your history and heritage. I engage at the intersection of crafting the narrative about what the stories are that are told about me, told about my people, told about my tribe and my Africa. So ladies and gentlemen, things I would like to see changed and have a change affected in is the use of language, the types of terminology that people use. Most intangible cultural heritage gets lost in translation. And I'd like to see PhDs emerge in local vernaculars, classification systems, and intangible indigenous knowledge documentation, which is that reclamation, which is that ownership of this information. This panel deals with the role of Namibian museums in research. when we think of research or we speak about research, the first thing that we think about is access to information, access to people, access to spaces, access to what you have. And we are all very fortunate because all of us come, the first thing that informs us is that we have a background. It's where you've been, it's what you were born into, it's your experiences, which are your first form of what informs you, what gives you information, right? And obviously then you look at the second one, which is if you're in a museum space, for example, then you would have, I call it the heritage within museums and galleries, if that's where you're working. I mean, the first form or the second form I would rather refer to in this presentation of information that you have are the colonial inheritances. It's what's been left behind. It's when you join as a curator or as an academic, what you find in those folders, what you find on those labels, what's been, in the archive, what is documented already in journals, catalogs, and books. And the last form of information that you could find is obviously what you would then have to do, which is your action research, right? That is you engaging in spaces, knowing this is till where it's come. This object is your point of reference, and you want to present an exhibition or display this object, and then you would have to go back and look at the history, the historiography of that time. Then you would also have to look at what are the gaps that are missing, what is there and what is not there, when was this last information added, right? And from there onward, you would have to look backwards, and you'd also try and have to look forward. And forward means if it's been dated 2000, and that's when the label was created, and that information is all that's present, what are you going to do to get it up to date to 2024? I mean, since 2000, it's 24 years later. So clearly there's new information that has come that you don't have access to yet. And that's what you as a curator or as a museum practitioner have to work towards, finding that information. And I refer to that as action research, right? This is the dialogue of palimpsest, right? Palimpsest. So, for example, the Oxford Dictionary refers to it as a manuscript or piece of writing material on which later writing has been superimposed and effaced. Earlier writing, something reused or altered, but still bearing visible traces of its earlier form. There's a sense of accountability that rests on everyone that is within that space, especially responsible for information, its acquisition, as well as its dissemination. And when we are thinking of an object and how you're going to present this object, and you finding that missing information, or you updating that information relating to that object or that exhibition, for example, there is tours that you would do. You would be presenting and talking about this work, and you would be making reference to things that you have thought about, things that you have seen, spaces you've been exposed to that have similar exhibitions at etc. And that is what is not actually documented on the label. And I think that's where we have these incongruencies, because you want to, whatever information that you have, which is it's your information that is kind of informing your practice, or it's information that you have read up, or it's just additional information that was shared with you. If you're going to relay that, make sure that you add that information onto, whether it's the label or into the catalog or into the file that is relating to that object or that exhibition. It's a responsibility and accountability that we as curators, researchers, academics have to take when we are dealing with. And these are the politics that I refer to, because many a times information resides within the person, and this information is not accessible on any of the documentation relating to an object, for example. I want to make reference to what had happened while I was at the National Art Gallery of Namibia in 2021. So we presented the triennial in 2021 due to COVID-19, as it was supposed to be presented in 2020, the COVID-19 global pandemic. And there were baskets, right? Like a vast number of baskets that were submitted. We always have them like from all over Namibia. And obviously for those of us who don't understand what symbolism is, this is very key. One of the things that happened while we were working towards the display of these baskets, and also the awarding of prizes for the craft category, and the craft category being renamed to customary contemporary art, right? We all know the debate, craft versus art. If it's art, obviously the value is higher. Who classified our objects? It was the Westerner. When they did that, it brought the value of our objects to a lower, So for us to reclassify, re-identify, for us to re-establish ourselves, we need to be the ones who identify what is there, how we want to deal with it, and name ourselves, as opposed to being, dealing with a name that's somehow superimposed on you. So that's it, that in the background. When the one of the judges, she looked at the baskets and she's like, oh my gosh, yeah, this is the design for when you have a child, right? And when you get married, you get something that looks like this. I stood there with my phone out and I immediately hit like the record button, because that's what you want. That's access to information. I'm not from the Oshivambu tribe. She is. She was immediately able to identify. So when I would step now, or anybody who is of Oshivambu heritage steps into a house and there are these baskets, or you serve people in the baskets, or because they are utility items, right? They're design objects. They serve function and purpose within spaces. They're not just for decorative elements, for example. So when you would enter, immediately, without this person having to say nothing, you can tell this person has a child, is a mom, or this person is married, or this person is at this stage in their life, for example. And I think that's the symbolism and the value our objects carry. And when I speak of decolonizing the practice, it's dealing with those types of information that adds value to what it is we sit with, which is inherent knowledge. It's not something that we were taught in schools, but the importance of relaying that information back into an education system. And that's where the documenting is so important. That's where we need to highlight how we research, how we access that research, because when I would just like to speak about the research practices, where it's all written documents, or it's all you tape the audio, you get someone to transcribe it as best they can, and a lot of African cultures are spoken in anecdotes, it's spoken in storytelling, and we miss the importance and the values of what that means, because in that vernacular, it has a deeper sense of meaning, as opposed to when you've translated it back into English. And that's where the loss of meaning comes in. And that's part of the politics of when we talk about the politics of researching and documenting practices. For us to move away from how it was done, and for us to take the value, inserting it back into our objects and dealing with it in the local vernacular as it deems the respect, right? Therefore, research should not be conducted only on what you have in the museum or the gallery or the archive. The objects in museums and galleries and archives serve as points of engagement for the researcher or curator to expand on the scope of contextualization beyond the object provenance within its historiography. Once again, it's important for me to highlight here that the borders were colonial constructs. It's not something that it was superimposed on us. It's not something that we decided to, demarcate ourselves and segregate people and group people. And because of this history, when we think of even baskets, we cannot think of baskets just within Namibia, because there's a history that exists with baskets in South Africa, in Botswana, because everybody moved across, so there's this sharing of information, of knowledge across all these veins. And when I now get into a much deeper section of how I came about what these look like, then it'll all become clear. So when I was recruited by the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a fellow, one of the key things that I was looking at was the institutionalism of the organization and how that informs the individual actions of the individuals in the institution. And then I additionally looked at the programs and how those were informed by the existing institutional documents, right? So for example, the Met presents itself as a very open, and it wants to receive information, it wants to give access to people. And because of that, I have access to the space. So, but the documents like the strategic plan and they only have an exhibitions policy, like a collections policy, not an exhibitions policy. So the strategic plan, the old one and the new one that they were at the time dealing with, none of it had the diversity, inclusion, none of that was part of the strategic plan. However, in my discussions that I had with Denise Murrell, when she was recruited by the Met, one of the first things that they worked on with her, because she worked within the practice of decolonization, was the construction of the 13 commitments. And these 13 commitments included, diversity, inclusion, making sure that, persons who were not represented before are represented now. And this document is dated 2019. But this document exists as a separate entity on the intranet of the Met, right? So when I was looking only at these strategic plans and the policies, and had not had information or access yet to the 13 commitments, obviously I didn't understand how some exhibitions or the outcomes from, the institutional documents and the programs and how it flowed out, how some looked like it had inclusion practices, diversification practices, and others not. Only up until the time when I met them with Denise, and which was like 6 months into my period at the Met. And then it made sense that there's people who are open to it, but because it's not institutionally imposed, I can choose to not partake in such practices within my curatorial, right? And one of the exhibitions that I will reference for the sake of us being, at the Museum of Namibian Fashion is the Costume Institute of the Mets in America. It's a lexicon of fashion in America, a lexicon of fashion and an anthology of fashion. So it was 2 exhibitions. It was a 2-part exhibition. It's one exhibition broken down in 2 parts. So one was presented this year in 2021. The other one was presented in the next year, which was in 2022. And in America, the lexicon of fashion, the 2021 exhibition included things like, A$AP Rocky's patchwork cloak that he wore to the Met Gala. It's part of the exhibition. So for me, it was like home ground when I was standing within that exhibition. It's like, oh, well, my, Quaker Kebab heritage deals with patchwork. So I was able to look at Ralph Lauren jerseys, Ralph Lauren patch dresses, and put that in conversation with our patchwork practices, within Namibia, and that's the write-up. So we will get to that, but that's the contemporizing of, like what we have and how you bring it to the now, how you bring it to the most relevant that it can impact now. How do we make sure that we can include it into, our education systems, the universities, for example, or even our the schools, how that information can become digestible by our now generation, because many a times history is not received positively. History itself has brought itself into a very negative light, but us that are the practitioners within that space of history and documenting and how we reinterpret, especially through museums, exhibitions and books, and how we interpret that material could be the thing that is needed in reviving our cultural genocide that has taken place. So what had happened was that for an anthology, the second part, they created period rooms. They took the period rooms are like, the decorative arts of America, for example, from this period to that period, that period to that period. And within these period rooms, which had plates, chairs, beds, which had design elements, which had all of that, they positioned the costumes on the mannequins in that space. But these costumes were not only Met collection costumes. So when we are thinking of research and documenting practices, we have to think it's not only what I'm sitting with. You have to think what else is available beyond what I'm sitting with, and how do I access that? Because one of the things that they were able to do very, very, very well was look at other spaces like the Studio Museum, the Harlem, in Harlem. What can we get from there? What do they have that we do not have? Because mind you, when people were collecting according to who they were, right? And who they were is not necessarily the true reflection of the time. So if I'm in a space and I am of dark skin color and I have access to objects that are of dark skinned people, that's what will be reflected in that collection. Unless I make effort, action research, and I move towards spaces that have pale skin color people and I start collecting their objects as well, then I have a representation which is a coherent representation. Otherwise, it's just collecting what's in your environment, right? politics of documenting and research practices. So what the Costume Institute did was they were able to collect and collaborate with these institutions and on loan bring works of artists who were previously not acknowledged even as fashion designers, for example, or that were just referred to as tailors, right? And I deal with classification systems as a core theme, because if someone decides, whilst I speak Oshivambu, Oshiherero, and Damara, because they heard me once speak Oshivambu, Desiree is Oshivambu, which sometimes happens. There's many people in different towns who speak all the languages. And you will decide, because you heard that person in that one situation speaking that one particular vernacular, you've decided that person is that. That's a classification, right? And that classification, only that person can rectify by saying, no, actually, my parents are this and that's what makes me this. Yeah, that's for another day. So that classification of this is what we have, that's what you have, but based on what I'm trying to present, to make it a coherent story, I need inclusion of that which you have, so that the story that we are telling is a story that truly reflects in America. That was the point of it, right? So for the curators and the researchers, the work that they had is not looking only of the provenance research of the objects that are in their collection. They had to spend time looking at other collections, which is so important. Like, you have to, if we're all in Namibia, I have to be concerned with what's in that other museum, what's in that other gallery. I have to concern myself with that, because it's a representation of who we are as Namibians. But if I'm only concerned with one particular place, I only look at one space objects, and that's my point of reference when I'm doing a lecture or when I'm doing a teaching or a workshop, then I've done a disservice to whom we are as a nation of Namibia, for example. And there's a lot, like just recently, I was able to attend a wedding, and the lady, she's of Nama tribe, but her dad is Oshivambu. And we were told, oh no, you have to get, she sends the color, you have to get Oshivambu dresses this color. And when we arrived, it was so beautiful of her, how she paid homage. The culture is that we slaughter a cow by them, and they come and slaughter a cow by our house. And what she did was, she stuck with the culture of slaughtering the cow, which is not an Oshivambu thing. It was like, it's a very Nama thing of slaughtering at each other's houses. But she made us wear Ovambu dresses as homage to her father and him being Oshivambu, right? And I thought that was a beautiful representation of progression, because we can say, oh no, I'm Nama, I'm sticking to this. Oh no, but we must recognize that things have interchanged, things have overlapped. And when I think of my practice, for example, it's very much the patching of that which is missing, getting to grips with what has been left out, including that which has not been spoken about, and bringing that to the fore. That remains my practice. That's my decolonial practice, because obviously how things were written, it was very selective, and it was perspectives that were not my perspective, but other people's perspectives. So bringing in that perspective of mine, or my people, or my country, that is very important to me. What the Met further did was, they took that in America, an anthology of fashion exhibition, positioned the mannequins within that space that they also borrowed from other spaces on loan, and then they got cinematographers. And this is for where I think the contemporizing of our cultural heritage is of utmost importance. We have to think, how are we going to get this message we want to get across? How are we going to do that, right? Like, you cannot just say we want feet in the gallery, because everybody's going to sit and take out their phones, and what they see online, that's what they're going to write about. Or students are studying, that's the access of information they have, that's what they're going to deal with. And that's limited if you as a space are not working towards including other spaces within your space, or dealing with the whole coherent story within. It deals with, whether something is real or fake. Is it staged or not? those are the politics that you have to look at, because everybody can take out a phone now and be recording, right? And that's the real, because that's in real time. But if every time something has to be staged, then it means you are not representing it in its most authentic manner. Just putting it out there. What they did with the cinematographers was that they included famous cinematographers, but then one I want to make reference to is Regina King, because Regina King is an actress of dark skin color. Regina King started making films, she's, but they included her especially for that era of works of people of color who were not included in the Met collection for the Costume Institute. And that choice, just that choice in itself is what does the shift in the exhibition, because you can have someone else who is of pale skin color try and present and deal with and represent and have that story created, those vignettes created, and will it be authentic? Because Regina's stories that she's told, even in her personal life, and that's the research, right? In her personal life, what has that person been dealing with? That's what you have to look at. And her parents and how she came, how she was ended up born there, and that history of that historiography of hers was key in her selection, as in to tell the history of that period. And that's where we miss stuff. If we don't make that connection, then you can have all the objects, you can have all the information, but will you have that thing that just takes it over the edge, that makes it an exhibition where people go back, or people stand in and they actually cry, or people walk out of and they feel like, I don't know what that is, it remained with me. There's a nostalgia, there's like that memory, like you still think back to it over and over. And that's the power of a powerful exhibition, when you can make those connections actually happen. And in how they document it, it's not just photographs, it's a whole film. And that progression of that upgrade of what had happened, because we are used to, it's an online exhibition, I'm going to be looking at stills, photographs. Moving away from that, including those other aspects that make people feel that they are part of the process, as if they're actually exploring the room and part of the room, and how the room flows from this is where it starts and this is where this was, and that's how it ends. They were able to have the cinematographers create that experience, which is available online even for you to have access to now. And when I think of information, the politics of researching and documenting and how that information remains current and relevant is where we position it. Because if that is not on YouTube, if it is not on, spaces where people are researching this information, you can't say the work's in vain, but have you really done what needs to be done for it to reach where it needs to reach, and for it to have a shelf life beyond the exhibition period, right? The hashtag What's Your Story was a project I proposed in 2020 when the global pandemic hit, and we were literally migrating everything online for the National Art Gallery of Namibia. And when we started looking for art material to provide to the artists, we realized, obviously, because borders are closed, we didn't have access to, art material. And what ended up happening was a conversation with one of our German artists, and she stood with me in the gallery. She said, I find my pigments from Opur. Within 24 hours, I have my paints. I don't buy acrylics. And the power of that conversation was, it was me speaking to an older German woman. If anybody knows the history of Namibia, right? Like, you would think that she will choose to paint in acrylics. And her decolonial practice is how she's sourcing materials for her creativity. It's part of documentation. It's with an Nagan right now, part of documentation of how we make sure that what's shared, getting to grips with that information and positioning that into folders. Whoever comes should be able to have access to that information, so that that person, the museum, the gallery, can feed information into an education system, like a tertiary institution, like a school, for example. I drafted, or one of the outcomes of my doctoral degree is a curriculum on decolonial practice, and it's not only for what do you call it, for creative industries. It literally is across the board. It's like for all industries, within business, within banking, finance, within health systems, education systems, how you decolonize spaces. And it looks at obviously the institutional and whether that's enforced, other refresher courses, but then it also delves very much into, you know, like the institutional segregation which resides within the documenting, in the practices. And this is, for example, I did that as part of the PhD, where me and a pale skin color friend of mine, we're both the same age, we went to apply for house loans. And I mean, we both have one child, but the risks for me were higher than it was for her. And it was an institutional thing because I earned more than she did, right? And I had more remaining than she did. So when you looked at that balance, it was like, how come she gets to buy for that value and I can only? And it is because of the inherent residing within spaces, you know, within documents, within programs, the discrimination that's embedded. Naturally, when you tick those demographics, you're Black, you are female, you're a single mother, there's a higher risk profile that shows up for you, as opposed to a white female who is single, who is a single mother. You know, it's when you tick those demographics, the systems, the inherited legacy of that system is within our banking system. And unless that can be broken up there, we will still be living in oppression. Black people will still be paying higher rates for every loan or everything that they want to do, right? So, like, just in a nutshell, that's that. And that's why researching is so important. And that's why I use myself in all those examples. When I get into a space, I use myself. That's the autoethnography. I place myself center, and what would I do? Where would I want to see that happening? And the last thing I wanted to talk about, obviously, was the flow of information, the sustainable chain of how this information should be flowing, and how something like, you know, amending your curriculum, or making sure that you are revising your curriculum, that you can add what needs to be added, that you can remove what is no longer relevant to you. You know, when we did the What's Your Story, how artists were creating, you know, Namibia is known for people creating really from nothing, and how that was so vivid in that exhibition, and even in the information that remained afterwards. And how powerful that is, how powerful that narrative is, as opposed to if everybody had received acrylics and canvas, for example, you know, and how much more different dimensions and layers we were able to receive out of that in its scarcity. But it was not scarcity. We went back to the origins. And that's the power of it. That's the indigenous knowledge. I think that's the genius of who our people are. So the more research is done, and documenting is action practice within the research, right? The information can feed into other areas that can build up our own structures, our own practices, our own institutions. If nothing new is within an exhibition display, if I've been there 5 years ago, I come back and I still see the same thing, has really nothing changed in that time. When we were preparing for that wedding, the Oshibambu dresses, one of the dresses that I bought for my little one was an Udelela dress, because my daughter herself is Oshibambu, right? Her father is Oshibambu, so she's mixed, she's Oshibambu Kwekakova tribe, and the dress is patched in Udelela, right? And that's the progression. So when you're thinking of showcasing, you're thinking of, yeah, you want to show that we've been here and we've moved from here. This is, you know, like your timeline. This is where we are now. You know, this is what's happening. And it's that dynamism of people. And that's the beauty of it in it for me. So when I think of collection practices, documenting practices, representation, interpretation of objects, we have to think of it beyond just what we sit with, and beyond just what's your environment, and really expand yourself and expand your practice itself, so that when you are thinking, one of the things that, I mean, I was a researcher with Open Restitution Africa on the Confronting Colonial Past, Envisioning Creative Futures project that the man was running, you know, and One of the outcomes there was that I saw that Joe Vision Production was working together with the National Art Gallery in preparation documenting films, and that in itself opens another door basically for the National Art Gallery of Namibia, because now they don't have to go to the like the generic, the ones we know, for funding, but it opens other doors of access for whether you can create a sustainable form of income for yourself or your institution. And as we all know, most of the times the creative industries is very much regarded as, like back of the line, you get the bare minimum. But if spaces can find these ingenious ways of, collaborating with each other, with other people, with other spaces, and I mean, for the past 3 years, for 2020 I was with the NAG, in 2021 I left the NAG, in 3 years I've been engaged primarily with international spaces, and that in itself has been such an eye-opener to see how people deal with their objects, their art, their architecture, and that we can do a lot more with where we are and what we have. And I think we are so much more well off. Namibia has returns which haven't happened for other African countries yet, for example. So we have positives that we can use within our, proposals and for, making sure that we can become a self-sustaining type of industry, and finding other forms instead of just, being very much government reliant. So we dealt with the contemporizing, text, audio, video, as that's very important. And I'll conclude with this: let's elevate our presentations in museums and galleries. Let's elevate them. Let's bring them to a place where anybody can walk in, and not only people who have interest for that. Somebody will stand and watch that 2-minute video because they like watching videos, but not everybody's going to read that 2-page text, for example, so let's reach more people by exploring these different modes. Yes, it does make you work double and triple at times, because now you don't just write, now you have to record yourself, now you have to market it to platforms. It requires that, but that's the industry we're in, and it'll only be as good as how good we are, and how good we make it, and how exciting we make it. I mean, I want to see films, I really want to see films. Like there's some, like Katutura is brilliant, like how that interpretation was done. I want to see more of that. That makes us look so cool, right? So thank you so much for your time.